All right, we're going to continue on in the Passion Week here, and we are going to start looking at the trial of Jesus. Uh, there's a lot to cover today, so I'm going to start moving through it. Um, but we're going to start looking. Jesus has been arrested. He was betrayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now he is arrested and standing trial before the various leaders. Um, I'm going to start reading in John chapter 18. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. I've spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews came together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. Is this the way you answer the high priest? He demanded. If I said something wrong, Jesus replied, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. This passage it starts off actually saying that the high priest Annas was questioning Jesus, and it ends by saying that Annas sent Jesus to Caiaphas, the high priest, which is odd because the high priest, there's only one high priest position supposed to be filled, and so um, want to kind of talk about this for a second. So Annas was Caiaphas's father-in-law. And under Roman control of Israel, Roman leaders were very concerned with controlling the position of the high priest because it was a very powerful position. And so, even though, biblically speaking, the high priest position was supposed to be lifelong, they were often deposed and under Roman leadership and removed from their place of authority and replaced with someone that the Romans thought that would be a little easier to control. That would be a little more of a pawn for the Romans. And so, whenever a high priest ceased to be easy to control, they were removed and somebody else was put in place. And so, Annas was deposed for carrying out capital sentences, which had been forbidden by the Romans. So that's very interesting, seeing as Jesus' trial was a capital trial as well, meaning that trial with the punishment of death. And the Jews were not supposed to have that authority. And so Annas was removed because he kept having capital sentencing people to death when he had no authority under Roman law to do so. So, despite being removed from his position, he kept some of his authority, or a significant amount of his authority, in fact, in Jerusalem. Because after he was removed, his sons-in-law rotated through the position. So there was a priest, one of his sons, or son and son-in-laws would move through. And so one of his sons took the position after him, and then he only lasted a couple years. And then Caiaphas moves in, and Caiaphas was his son-in-law. And he actually, out of all of the Annas relatives, held the position the longest, coming in around, I want to say it was about 14 to 18 years. So a very long time for him in that position. Still not a lifetime, still not technically what would be considered a high priest position according to Levitical law. But for the Romans, that was a very, very long time. And Annas and his family had this reputation of being kind of like the mafia. This was not a good, Annas is not a good man. Caiaphas is not a good man, as you can kind of gather by what they're doing to Jesus here. Um, they were kind of known as the mafia. And the Talmud, another significant text to the Jews, says this about the family of Annas and Caiaphas. It says, woe to the house of Annas, woe to their serpents hiss. They are high priests, their sons are keepers of the treasury. Their sons-in-laws are guardians of the temple, and their servants beat people with staves. So this is not very good words about Annas and his family, and basically it's letting us know that Annas manipulated it so that every one of his sons or family members was in some position of power within the temple structure. And so it didn't matter where you went, there was authority and power in Annas' family. And so it became kind of like the mafia. And Annas was kind of like the Don of the mafia, the father figure, the one that ruled the family. And so it was actually his family's money booths that were set up selling in the temple that Jesus tore down. And so there's a reason Annas gets so upset, the high priest gets so upset around this point and really start trying to kill Jesus, because he came for their money. and so Jesus tears this down, and then they're like instantly a plot to kill Jesus forms. And so because the high priest position was technically for life, and Annas was the leader of that mafia family, he maintained a whole lot of his authority, and the title of high priest, it just was not technically high priest to the Roman as far as the Romans were concerned, but the Jews saw him as their high priest, and so there were technically two at this time. And so this is why Jesus goes to see him first, because he's the father of the family, and then he sends him on to Caiaphas to be seen by Caiaphas. So continuing on in Mark, we see that Jesus, they start referencing the other high priest. So they took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself by the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, "I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another, not made with hands." Yet even then their testimony did not agree. And then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit on him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, "Prophesy." And the guards took him and beat him. So, in true mafia fashion, Jesus' trial broke a number of laws. At least 4 laws are broken here. And so I'm going to tell you which law is broken, and then I'm going to read a quick quote from one of the Jewish religious texts that is known as the Mishnah, that talks about that specific law, just so you can see kind of what Jewish law actually says. So, trial happened at night. That was the first thing. In cases of capital law, remember capital punishment is a crime that is with a condemnation of the death penalty. The court judges during the daytime and concludes the deliberations and issues the ruling only in the daytime. All right, so that's supposed to happen at night, and all of these trial proceedings take place in secret in the middle of the night. Next, the trial happened in the high priest's courtyard. This is probably because it was largely in secret. And let me read for you from the Mishnah again. And if not, those judges come to the high court, the Sanhedrin of 71 judges, that is the chamber of hewn stone. So it's again referencing, if you read in the context, capital crime here. And so they're supposed to go to the Sanhedrin chamber of hewn stone, which was on the northern wall of the temple. And so they didn't hold it at the proper place. Also, they guarded the gate and only let certain people in. And so this was a big deal. We see this in Mark chapter 18. But Peter had to wait outside of the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. So they actually had this secret trial in the high priest's house. It was there so that it could be held in secret. So that was law number 3. Law number 4 is the trial happened on a holiday. Remember, this is Passover here. And so, therefore, since capital cases might continue for 2 days, the court does not judge cases of capital law on certain days, neither on the eve of Shabbat nor the eve of a festival. And so they were not allowed to have it on a holiday, because they might have it might take a couple days to do the trial properly, and so they didn't want it to be rushed, and they also didn't want they didn't want it to be rushed, and you could not work on the Sabbath anyway. So it was supposed to be only held when you had uh, not the night before a holiday. Another law they broke: no 24-hour waiting period was given before the verdict was given. So they didn't see Jesus to wait 24 hours and then give his sentence. They immediately worked on sentencing him right away. And let me read again from the Mishnah. In cases of capital law, the court may conclude the deliberations and issue the ruling even on that same day to acquit the accused, but must wait until the following day to find him liable. And this was so that the judges, when you're deciding someone's fate, somebody's life, they had to have time to process the information. If it was a serious enough claim for that, then then the law wanted the judges to take their time with it, to not rush somebody's life. So you've got all of these laws that are broken. Jesus visits these two high priests, and then he is taken to Pilate, Pontius Pilate. Now, Pilate had a bad reputation among the Romans and the Jews, and I want to give you some historical context to what's going on here in Jesus' trial, because there's a lot of context that's given that's mentioned, but we don't actually have it because we aren't familiar with the timeline and who the different people were apart from the story. So, um, a general Roman policy across all Roman ruled countries was that you had to worship the emperor, you had to worship the Roman gods. But the Romans made an exception in the case of Jerusalem and in the case of Israel. The Roman policy was that the Jews have general religious freedom to do whatever they want, because the Jews were known to become exceptionally volatile if you restricted that religious freedom. And so their attitude was, well, what harm does it do? We'd rather have control than have a riot on our hand. And so they were allowed religious freedom, which was somewhat unique in Roman days and in the Roman Empire. But so the Jews in Israel remained relatively free during this time. Now, Pilate, however, he was a big proponent for emperor worship, and he was constantly pushing it on the Jews. Remember, this goes against Roman policy in Israel. And two different times he attempted to establish these images of the emperor in Jerusalem, where they were like set up for people to worship or to encourage people to worship him. And so once he used the Jewish temple money to finance an infrastructure improvement plan as well. And so like he said, well, okay, I don't really care about your temple because you're not worshiping the God I want you to worship. So I'm going to steal from your fund and I'm going to build stuff with that money. Each of these three occasions led to near rebellion, and on the last occasion actually led to Pilate avoiding rebellion by massacring a whole bunch of unarmed civilians. And so Pilate was not a great dude. Pilate actually, in the long run, was actually deposed as well because he massacred some people again. And so, like, he was not a great guy. And so, just about every person in power in Israel, that's Herod and all the different authority figures, were known for complaining about Pilate and all the unrest that he caused. In fact, we have historical record for much of this. Pilate was not well liked, and so there were lots of complaints about him to Rome, and he was on pretty thin ice. And so historians look at this situation. They look at Caiaphas, who remains in power for so many years, and Pilate, who was on thin ice, and they figure that Caiaphas would probably put in a good word for Pilate in exchange for his own power. So they had a mutually beneficial agreement. Like Caiaphas will defend Pilate, and Pilate will make sure that Caiaphas maintains his power and authority. And so, in a sense, Caiaphas actually had the advantage over Pilate because If Pilate was suddenly got a bad word from someone like Caiaphas, he might even get executed. So his was a pretty big deal. And so this would explain for why Caiaphas stays in power for 14 years, while every other one of his family members only had the authority position of high priest for around 2 years. So it would also explain why both Pilate and Caiaphas were both removed from power in the same year within a few months of each other. So there's some circumstantial evidence. We don't know this for sure, but it is likely that they had some kind of political alliance that was somewhat tense, but it worked. And so this is all the political context that fuels what I'm about to read you with Pilate and Scripture. There's a whole lot going on here that is not written about in the Bible. So let me read Luke chapter 23. Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be the Messiah, a king." So Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. Then Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." But they insisted. "He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here." On hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean, and when he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased, because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had hoped about him, he hoped to see him perform a sign of some sort. And he plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave no answer. The chief priests and the teachers of the law were standing there vehemently accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him. Dressing him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. That day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate called rulers and the chief priests and the rulers and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who is inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence, and I have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him." All right, so Pilate knows the Jews are volatile and that he is on thin ice. He probably knows his time is limited in this position, and he wants to extend it as long as possible because his life could genuinely be on the line if it's not. And so here he is, and one of the biggest threats to him staying in power is that things stay peaceful in Israel. Because if he keeps riling them up, he's likely to be removed from his position by Rome. And so instead, he wants to maintain peace. And so they're kind of threatening all these charges against Jesus are something that could cause insurrection, basically. And they're threatening it, and he does not want anything to do with it. And so, to make matters worse, it's Caiaphas who's asking, so he can't fire or control Caiaphas if what we think is true about his relationship with Caiaphas. And so he's kind of in between a rock and a hard place. But then it's mentioned that Jesus is a Galilean. And when he finds that out, he says, "Oh, you have a different governor than me. Oh, thank goodness. I did not want to do this." And so he passes him off to Herod, who happens to be in Jerusalem at the time. And Herod is the governor over the Galilee region. So Herod makes no judgment and sends him back to Pilate as well. And we've been seeing royal imagery used here. There's more imagery that surrounds Jesus during this scene as well, when Herod dresses him in this royal robe and sends him back to Pilate. And so he's visited two governors now, two high priests, and he's back with Pilate. And Pilate tells the Jews that he finds zero fault worthy of death, and he's either going to punish Jesus and then release him. And so Jesus is going to be whipped, and the point is to do some punishment to maybe calm them down. But I think that there may be a little more as well to it as well. But I'll talk about that in a minute. I'm sorry, I'm yawning. So at this point, Pilate is trying to actually save Jesus, and so he mentions this guy named Barabbas. Let me read Matthew 27. Now it was the festival's custom the governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time, they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Jesus Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked him, which one do you want me to release to you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah? For he knew it was out of self-interest that they had handed Jesus over to him. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message: "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" asked the governor. "Barabbas," they answered. "What shall I do then with Jesus who is called the Messiah?" Pilate asked. They all answered, "Crucify him." "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, remember he's terrified of revolution, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I'm innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It is your responsibility." All the people answered, "His blood is on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas to them. But he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Okay, let's talk about this Barabbas situation. Remember the Day of Atonement, one of the biggest feast days other than Passover, probably the biggest feast day other than Passover. And it's the day that the high priest of Israel could make atonement for the entire nation of Israel. It's the one day that the high priest was allowed into the Holy of Holies, and the only day and the high priest was the only person allowed in there. And so this Day of Atonement was where the sins of Israel were made, atonement was made for them. And so throughout the trial and the crucifixion, Jesus actually takes on a couple of roles from the Day of Atonement. But the most significant part of the Day of Atonement, it surrounds these two goats. And I've talked about this in our lesson. This is kind of a review, so I'm not going into near as much detail as I did the first time around, but I want you to see it here in this context of everything else. So Leviticus 16, it tells us that that lots or chance bets basically were cast, and a goat was selected. Think of it like flipping a coin. A goat was selected and sacrificed, while the other goat would go free. And so the goat that went free represents Israel's sin and would be covered in the blood of the innocent goat, which was sacrificed. And and so by the blood of this innocent goat, the sinful goat was released. Now, that being said, file all that information away in your head, because it was the Passover custom for Pilate to release one prisoner to the Jews. Whoever the Jews wanted or voted on, they would be released. And he probably did this to keep them happy, since he was struggling with that. And he found zero fault or guilt with Jesus. And so he decides, not only that, but his wife sends him a message saying, "Hey, I've had a bad dream from the gods saying not to kill this innocent man. Whatever you do, do not let him die." And he gets this message while he's on the judgment seat. And so he's trying to free Jesus at this point. But he's kind of in this hard spot about he doesn't have much that he can do. And so he decides he's going to give the Jews a really bad choice for their, or what Pilate would consider a bad choice for the person that they can free. So here's an innocent man, and then there's this guy named Barabbas. Now, looking at his name, it tells us a whole lot. But first of all, the Bible tells us that Barabbas was a prisoner for rebellion against Rome. So he was a zealot, and he was a violent zealot, and was particularly imprisoned for killing people. So you have this murderous zealot, and then you've got an innocent man, innocent religious teacher, Jesus. And so when we look at his name, Barabbas, it's not a first name, actually. Barabbas is a last name. In Jewish culture, your last name, I've told you this before, as a man, was who you were the son of. son or daughter of. And so this was communicated by this prefix, this little phrase that goes on the front of the word, which is bar or ben. And if you're a guy, if you're a girl, it was bat. And so, for example, I'm the son of Seth, and so my name and last name in Jewish and Hebrew would be Caleb bar Seth, or Caleb son of Seth. Now, Barabbas is Bar Abbas. Abba means father. So Barabbas means son of the father. And so the name Barabbas is actually probably used in the Gospels to avoid confusion. We think of it as a first name, but it is instead a last name, means son of the father. And it's a generic name. And Matthew 27:16 tells us that Barabbas' first name was Jesus as well. I always miss that detail, but I think that's incredibly interesting. So now you have two men named Jesus, just like you have two identical goats. And the similarities go even further. Both men were accused of insurrection with a punishment of death. One man was guilty, the other man was innocent. Both men were named Jesus. Both men were sons of the Father, Jesus being son of the Father God. Barabbas being just son of the Father, generic. And so both men are known as being sons of the Father. And so both men are up for freedom, and yet it was by the blood of Jesus that is innocent of any guilt that the thief and murdering son of the Father got to go free. Barabbas, the other son of the Father, Jesus Barabbas, gets to go free by Jesus' blood. And so here in the Day of Atonement, you've got two identical male goats. They're identical. They're supposed to be the exact same. And only by the blood of the innocent goat that the lot falls on is the goat that's burdened with the sin of Israel let free. And so that blood of the sacrificial blood is rubbed on the head of the goat that is the scapegoat. And that goat travels out and carries the sins of Israel out of the camp. And it's the blood is what lets it go free. So what does the high priest do when he's done with making atonement with a sacrificial goat? Well, according to the Day of Atonement, he was then supposed to wash himself. And so after Pilate gives Jesus up to be crucified, what does he do? He washes his hands with water. And so Jesus and Pilate, Jesus takes on and Barabbas take on the role of the goat. Pilate here is taking on the role of the priest that sacrifices this goat to the innocent goat to be killed and releases the other one, and then he washes his hands. Now, Jesus himself is about to take on the role of the high priest in the Day of Atonement, as we'll see next week during the actual sacrifice. But this is some huge Day of Atonement imagery that's going on here that's trying to point to you about what Jesus is doing. Jesus is going to make atonement. He's going to be the one that dies, and because of it, our guilty selves can go free. In fact, we ourselves are sons of the Father, of fathers, and we ourselves are guilty, but by Jesus' blood we go free. Now, the coronation imagery continues even further. Let me read Matthew 27 again. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of the soldiers around him. They stripped him, put a scarlet robe on him, and twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand, then they knelt in front of him and mocked him. Hail the King of the Jews, they said. They spit on him and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. After they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. So, Jesus is taken into the praetorium, which is Pilate's house, and the entire company of soldiers is gathered in front of Jesus. The entire company is gathered. And so Mark tells us it was about a cohort, which is about 500 soldiers. So 500 soldiers gather in front of Jesus there. Note our church is about 300, and on a good Sunday we get that. So I think Easter Sunday, more soldiers than are in our church by about 200, and they are all gathered in front of Jesus, and he is then presented before these soldiers with the purple robe that Herod sent him back in, and he's holding a staff and wearing a crown of thorns. So he's presented before the soldiers just like a king before is presented before his army when he was first coronated. He has a crown of thorns put on his head, and is then given a staff. He's hailed by all of the Roman soldiers there, all 500 of them, the entire cohort, hail there the King of the Jews. It's also interesting, it was a Roman law that only Caesar was allowed to wear purple, and yet Luke tells us that the robe was purple, meaning that he was dressed as a king. He had a very expensive purple robe placed on him, and it was to mock him but it was still crowning him king, crowned with his thorns, and given the staff, and then the entire guard kneels before him. So while the guard is mocking him, this is a true this is coronation here, and these details are given to you. Luke and Matthew and all these the gospel authors, they want you to see this detail that here's your Messiah. He is being crowned king. This coronation just looks nothing like what you think it does. And what day is he crowned king? Passover, traditional coronation day, just like we talked about as he enters into Jerusalem, like Solomon did, and then the crowning day is on the actual Passover. And so Jesus is crowned king of his upside down kingdom in the most upside down way possible. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head, clothed him in purple, and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I am bringing him out to you, to let you know that I find no basis for charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify!" But Pilate answered them, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where did you come from?" he asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize that I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed them over to him to be crucified, so the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Okay, so Jesus, he's dressed as a king here, we're told, and then he's presented bloodied and dressed as a king to the Jews. Now, not only has he been crowned and presented before his soldiers, he's then presented before the Jews as well as king. And since Pilate, he was unable to free Jesus as he wants, he decides to use Jesus to mock Caiaphas. And so Pilate wants to show Caiaphas how weak this man is that Caiaphas is so afraid of. "Caiaphas, you're so terrified of this man. Look, I just whipped him within an inch of his life. He's bleeding. His flesh is hanging off him. He's got a crown of thorns on him and a robe, a purple robe, and he's being presented as your king, but he is nothing. Why are you so afraid of this man?" And so he's mocking Caiaphas in this moment almost. And here's your bloody and beaten king that you want killed so bad. And so what does Caiaphas do? Caiaphas says the one thing that will get him what he wants from the man who was this emperor worship fundamentalist. This circles back. "We have no king but Caesar." Now here's one of the biggest reasons the Jews refused to worship Caesar. They believed there was only one God, and that God was Yahweh. And they refused to acknowledge Caesar as king because their king was also God. And so to say that they had no king but Caesar essentially acknowledges Caesar as God. And so Jesus, so the Jews and Caiaphas, and it gets them to say, "We have no king but Caesar." And this is huge because this is a victory for Pilate. Pilate says, "Oh, okay, you can have him. I got what I wanted. You just declared Caesar as God." Meanwhile, they're killing God himself. And so all this historical context is happening at the same time. Now, there's one more thing that I want to point out to you before we wrap up this lesson. And I want to review this. I've talked about this as well, and that's that the trial accounts set up Jesus as our sin offering. And so when a sin offering needed to be made for the whole community, the elders had to bring a bull to be sacrificed. And so there were several sin offerings. You could do it for yourself individually, for a high priest, for community. And so if the whole community sinned, then there was a sin offering that needed to be made to atone for that. And it was a bull that was brought. And all the elders of the community would bring that bull forward. Leviticus 4:14-15 says, "And the sin they committed becomes known. The assembly must bring a young bull as a sin offering and present it before the tent of meeting. The elders of the community are to lay their hands on the bull's head before the Lord, and the bull shall be slaughtered before the Lord." So before his crucifixion, Jesus met with all of the Jewish leaders and rulers. All the elders of the Jews, Jesus met with them. Before his crucifixion, all those rulers were there. Herod, Pilate, Annas, Caiaphas, every one of them, Jesus meets with them all. And in that situation, these are the men who give Jesus up to death. Jesus is like the bull in the sin offering that the leaders of Israel present and slaughter for their sins. And so in the same way as the elders of Israel sit there and they slit the throat of the bull, it's these leaders together who gave Jesus the punishment of death. And so where Jesus would then go on to take the role of the high priest, and this next segment we'll look at that, and he would present the blood before God, the atonement for our sins, not just for the community, but for the entire world. So that will usher us into next week, where we talk about the actual death of Jesus. As always, if you have any questions, let me know.